I saw a note on a blog this morning that I found interesting given the reason we're here today, and that is 30 years ago this week, the first .com registration took place. So as Mark DeRamo said to me, Al, if we knew what was coming and we just bought a couple of words, we wouldn't be here today. We'd have made a fortune. But anyway, we all know what has happened since then, and part of it has a level of exposure perhaps that most of us don't know too much about. I've reviewed the material. It can be scary, but it is also realistic, and so I think part of your responsibility in coming was to learn more about what's going on out there and make sure you're properly protected. So I'm grateful to Bob Sager, who teamed up with me to find a team of experts, and in fact local experts, which is always to our advantage when we have people that you can reconnect with and get some help from in the future if you need it. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Mark Griesinger, who put together the panel. Protection is his business, so we're lucky to have an expert from Gladwin and a Friend Central parent with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Al, and Bob Sager for quarterbacking this whole event. Thank you, everybody here, for your morning. We're going to talk a little bit about cyber risk. I'm going to do some quick intros of our speakers. John Mullen could not be here today. His child got sick this morning, so we're lucky enough to have Jim Prendergast. Jim is an expert in cyber risk. His team deals with literally one data breach event a day in assisting, and they represent all the major insurance companies in this space. And they have a number of experiences with dealing with actual schools. So he's going to do an interesting talk on cyber liability and cyber risk. Myself, Net Diligence, we've been in business for 14 years. We primarily partner with all the major insurance companies in the world who offer cyber risk, cyber liability insurance coverage. And we assist those clients by assessing the security and privacy risks of the organizations they're interested in insuring. It could be a K through 12 school. It could be a Fortune 100 bank. It's all over the place. And Jamie Scheller, also with Net Diligence. Jamie's a lawyer specializing in privacy ethics, and she's here today to give a little bit of talk about board involvement in cyber-related matters. And then finally, Ben Falk. I've known Ben for a number of years. He is an expert as a broker when it comes to cyber liability insurance coverage, and he's going to give you an overview on that whole space. So with this first slide is a lot of household name companies here popping out at you. You can really barely go a week anymore without seeing some major company hitting the papers for some massive event that happened to them. One of the reasons why I want to just mention this is all these companies here, I can tell you right now, have $100, $200 million security budgets. 300 security folks doing nothing but protecting data every day, and literally something happens to them almost on a yearly basis. It's that challenging, it's that daunting, and there's a number of reasons for that, and I'm going to go into that. But a lot of it has nothing to do necessarily always with your IT folks who run your network. It's a lot of times it's mistakes. A lot of mistakes lead to class action lawsuits and third-party vendor mishaps. And I was talking with Bob Sager earlier about the proliferation of apps now that are happening with children. So we like to track data. How often is cyber risk impacting organizations and they're having crisis events and lawsuits? There's a number of public websites now tracking these kind of things literally on a daily basis. So I point out this chart to you. What's really driving this, just so you know, is there's 47 state laws now that basically will compel your organization to notify all the victims caught up in a data breach event, whether it's an accident or malicious. And once that happens, that's news for the plaintiff lawyers that come knocking on your door. We're increasingly seeing state attorney generals coming after organizations issuing fines and penalties for these kind of things. I put it up there, tip of the iceberg, because I believe about more than 50% of events that the entity willfully decides to not report it. They stick their head in the sand for a number of reasons. A lot of times they're really worried about their reputational hit. They're worried about incurring a class action lawsuit. But the other biggie is most organizations really have a tough time detecting a breach of their own network. They just don't have the intrusion detection capabilities. There's a study by Verizon out there. It says 70% of organizations who they forensically investigated, and they do thousands of investigations a year, 70% of them were told about a breach by some third party. They never detected it. One of the reasons why we're in business, and this is a hot issue these days, is we oftentimes speak for large insurance magazines like AM Best, Business Insurance, and so on. And recently, they've been coming to us asking for more articles, webinars, seminars, and we're like, what gives? Why the sudden interest? Past 2 years, I would say. They canvass all their CFOs and all the Fortune 5,000 companies who they insure. Cyber risk is coming in now as their #1 issue for private sector. Some common K through 12 school issues, and we have a newsletter and we track a lot of these events, and I would probably say we see a school have an issue almost on a daily basis somewhere in the country. It's a very common thing. But some of the challenges are data is really everywhere anymore. It's really challenging for K through 12 schools understanding, hey, what kinds of data do we have on the children? Where is that data actually reside? Is it within our servers, outside servers? Is it in laptops? Is it in apps? It tends to be all over the place. And actually having an inventory of that is really the challenging part. We do see, just so you know, we do see hacking happening. You read about that all the time in the paper. They hack in through SQL databases and other kind of common databases. But we see, I was telling the folks earlier, we see a lot of lost laptops with 10,000 records on there of children, medical data, that kind of a thing, usually unencrypted. We see a lot more, these days, obviously, a lot of iPhone and mobile devices, iPads, with tons of information, again, with no basic security controls in there. I mentioned earlier staff mistakes. It's just simple emails going out the door with social security numbers, date of births, sometimes medical records, student test scores, things like that. Very often, I would say vendor mishaps happen. The vendor might be in the care, custody, and control of your data. 1 in 3 events by the insurance industry, insurance industry pointed to the vendor actually having a claim, but the onus is still on you to make sure the vendors are doing a reasonable job. The plaintiff lawyer and attorney general will still be coming after you. The cloud, I got tired of hearing the word cloud a few years ago because it's such a buzzword. It's talked about constantly, and none of the CFO, corporate risk managers we spoke to mentioned it as a concern. That changed about the past 18 months. I would say 99% of companies now and schools are using the cloud in some way, and it's increasingly where you're outsourcing all your computing. And with the cloud comes a ton of risk. If you ever read a cloud contract, the service level agreements of it, it will be to the point where we'll say, if we as a cloud screw up, you agree to defend and indemnify us. It's that one-sided. And then there's this thing called big data, and big data is really, it falls under the umbrella of privacy ethics and just privacy in general, where organizations collect information on students, on alumni, on parents in a covert manner outside their posted privacy policy on their website. And to a plaintiff lawyer, that's a deceptive trade practice, and to attorney general. So it's not always about a security breach. It can be just wrongful data collection, wrongful use of that data in a non-transparent manner. Transparency is key. I mentioned OWL. I just, not to pick on any one school. This is just a sampling of what's happened out there. We just pulled these off of a database we keep internally that tracks these kind of events. There's hundreds of them. I just wanted to give you a sampling of, some of the schools that most recently had some events. And as you can see, it's from hackers, it's from staff mistakes, it's from rogue employees, it's lost laptops, it runs the gamut. So, how are these incidents occurring? This is really a high-level chart. So, some of them are accidental, caused by internal folks. Some of them are intentional, caused by disgruntled employees. We see that regularly, but also increasingly we're seeing it on the external side. Bad guys are constantly sniffing your networks, looking to see if they can get in. They might not even be interested in your school, your data per se. They might want to use your network, your systems to attack others, or as a launch pad as part of their network. And then again, I mentioned earlier, external vendor subcontractors. Very often they just have mishaps because they have poor controls in place. Some more reasons why this is happening. A lot of schools collect vast information, private information on students. You guys all know that. But we find oftentimes it's collected, sometimes more information is collected than what's actually needed. And then also the real problem is we find a lot of schools are holding the data indefinitely. A few months ago, there was a school breach and the bad guy got into 40 years of records. And so their exposure went up something like fourfold. He had that much data on past students and on contributions from alumni and so on, 40 years of records. Staff mistakes, I mentioned that, the insurance industry seeing 1 in 4 claims events just from a lost laptop with vast amount of private information. And then the last thing I'll talk about here is if you look at all the study of all the claims events, how bad guys break in, very often it's not a stealth hacking event. They rely on human error. You could see the number one guessable access in this day and age, if you could still believe, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's from a recent study from a consultant group. Some of the concerns, what our organization sees every day, we talk to a risk manager, a treasurer, a CFO, a school administrator. They're worried about the privacy class action lawsuits. This is just a small sampling of them. I told Al, I know you won't be able to see these cases. I just wanted to show you that there's just thousands of these events happening now. Plaintiff lawyers, attorney generals are coming after organizations. It might not be, again, your fault, but you're still in control of that student data, whether a vendor lost it or it was a staff mistake, something to that extent. And this is happening on a regular basis now. And I know Ben is going to get into some more of the risk management measures at the end of this with regard to what coverage is out there covering these kind of things. So my company, one of the things we do is working with about 80 of the major insurance companies like AIG, ACE, Chubb, Zurich, Lloyd's of London. They insure entities. We collect a sampling of their claims data each year for data breach crisis events. And our goal was to use it just for an educational report to teach folks like yourself on average, how often are things happening, and when they happen, what's it costing organizations. So this is just a glance of our most recent claim study. The average data breach event is costing an organization about $733,000. Now, for a large company, on average, that's $3 million. For the companies you're reading about in the paper, the Home Depots, the Targets, the Sonys of the world, you're talking $250 million. They're really outliers, I would say. But I highlighted here a small to medium-sized organization. That's really where I would put a K through 12 school. On average, that's probably the size of event you're going to see, $600,000 to $700,000 per event. Now, my school district, where we are in Lower Merion, they had a fairly large privacy breach event, and just the legal costs alone were over $1 million. I know that. The per record costs. A lot of folks in this industry like to look at the number of student records, number of alumni records, unique records we have in our system. What on average is that going to cost us if we were to have an event? Our study showed about $956 per record. A lot of that is driven by crisis service costs, and Jim Prendergast is an expert in this. He's going to go into some of these things, but whenever you have a breach event, and my understanding is as private schools, you don't have any of these immunities that sometimes public schools can bring in. But regardless whether you have immunity or not, you have to do under state law certain things. You have to forensically investigate the event to figure out who, what, when, where, and how. You have to figure out what private information was touched on the students. You then have to notify those victims, often in writing, sometimes offer them free credit monitoring just to kind of alleviate some of their concerns. Hire a breach coach. We call lawyers like Jim a breach coach, where they really understand the state and federal laws to the point where they even know the attorney general and the investigators, where they can kind of figure out what's the best way to maneuver here. But on average, just for those first few steps that happen in the first 48 hours, about $366,000 it's costing most organizations. And then if you were to be sued, the defense costs would be about $700,000. The settlement is about $558,000. So what can a school board, administrator, IT folk think about is really just prepping yourself to do some kind of annual cyber risk assessment. This is not something, that you have to hire an outside consultant for. We see a lot of organizations just do an internal assessment, and that's perfectly reasonable. But the whole point is to show that you at least took some effort to study what are your safeguards in place, and what are your weak spots and what can you do about it. Everybody understands security is not perfect. There's a saying kind of in our whole industry, it's not if but when, and it's pretty accurate. But if you were to have an event, it's important to be able to show the Attorney General, the plaintiff lawyers and those types that you didn't just sit back on your haunches, you did something proactively. You made an attempt to study what your cyber risks were across your whole organization. So you should measure to reasonable safeguards. It's also nice to measure against what your peers are doing, understanding what other schools are doing with regard to certain security, people, process, policy, technology, that kind of thing. The whole process hopefully is a collaborative one. This is not meant to be a scare you audit. It should really be discussion-based kind of an assessment. It should be educational, and it should look at not just, let's do a penetration test against your firewalls today. No, let's look at the people, the processes, the policy, and then the technology, kind of one wide angle. The little snapshot on the right of a report, and this is just giving you an example of what it could look like, but hopefully it has graphics in place to show how you measure up against peers and against industry standards. It should really be layperson friendly. That's the most important part of these kind of assessments. It's not meant for a chief security officer. This is meant for your average business person just to understand, do we have reasonable controls in place for a school of our size? We might only have 70 students, 300 students. School of our size with the kind of data that we have right now, we're safeguarding, do we have reasonable enough controls in place? That does not mean you have to throw the kitchen sink at the problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. It says John Mullen, but it's going to be Jim Prendergast. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Prendergast. Happy to speak with you today. Let me just give you a little tiny background on myself. I actually taught at the Haverford School for a few years before I went to law school. My brother was a Penn Charter guy. My wife went to Baldwin for some time, so we have a little private school experience in my family. I was an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia after law school, and our group now at Lewis Brisbois does nothing but data compromise and privacy issues. So if anybody has any question, please shout it out. The questions are usually, no matter what you think of them, they're almost always good questions. So I'm happy to field any question at any time. What I do all day and what everybody in our group does all day is represent institutions, businesses, governmental institutions, schools and universities that have had data compromises, are experiencing a data compromise, or hired us to help them with prevention, okay? So that's all we do all the time. We've represented big box merchants with millions and millions of credit cards exposed, and we've represented school districts that have had social security numbers exposed. We represented a school district last year where somebody hacked in and posted every student's social security number on Paisboa, their name, their home address. We've represented many, many universities that have been hacked and had and suffered identity theft and malicious posting. So we're very comfortable with the issues that affect you, okay? We talk very quickly about PII. It's the term of art for the data that triggers legal obligations and duties. Personally identifiable information, okay? Schools are regrettably treasure troves. Do I have an echo? Schools are regrettably treasure troves of PII. If you want a simple nuts and bolts off your fingertips definition of PII, it's name and social security number or name and unique identifier, okay? So if you have your students' social security numbers posted anywhere along with their name, you have PII. If you have employees, health plans, life insurance plans, any sort of benefits plans, you undoubtedly have their names, social security numbers, their spouses, their children's name and social security numbers. That's definitional PII. There's a fairly broad definition of PII. Unfortunately, the definition goes one way. It has evolved from a fairly narrow one to a larger one. And there's all of the statutes that have been written in the past 10 years have all gone in one direction, to expand the definition. Okay, 12 years ago, there were no data breach statutes. The whole area of the law is brand new. The definitions, the obligations, the legal duties and obligations are brand new. Okay, and unfortunately, it really does go one way. Bottom line is this: if you have had unauthorized access, if an intruder, an unauthorized person, has had access to PII, which was given to you, which is in your possession or control, you almost certainly have a notice obligation. That notice obligation usually runs to the affected individual, and it often runs to regulators, usually the Attorney General. Pennsylvania does not have a data breach statute which requires Attorney General notice. However, two things. The applicable law is not where your school is located, but rather where the affected individual resides. So if there was a hack into your network, your database, and you have student data from 5 years ago, if you keep alumni records, and those students are scattered all across the United States, you have a national breach. The truth of the matter is, many of our data compromises come in and the client says to us, Jim, everybody lives in Pennsylvania. Almost invariably, it's not true, particularly if you store data. It's the state of residence of the affected individual that triggers the notice, okay? And that can become a complication. Last week, I spent the entire week in Alabama. Alabama is one of 3 states that does not have a data breach statute. And yet, the client turned out, when we actually dove into their records, the affected individuals were scattered all over the United States, and they said, it'll never happen, it won't be true, maybe a few Georgians. We're in like 46 or 47 states by the time I left on Friday. PHI, I'll just touch on it briefly. It probably doesn't apply to you. PHI is protected health information. It's a HIPAA term, HIPAA high-tech. It pertains to health information, okay? And I won't go deep into this, but the affected entities are covered entities or business associates of covered entities. You're probably neither. However, your school nurse may have PHI obligations and duties. It's a tricky analysis, and I touch on it for this reason. If you have PHI, your notice, duties, and obligations flow from HIPAA high-tech. It's federal legislation. The duties are onerous, the deadlines are short, and the enforcement arm for HIPAA high-tech is the Office of Civil Rights of HHS. They routinely issue multi-million-dollar fines. Okay, I just touched on it briefly. It probably doesn't apply to you, but it might. That's PHI, and it would come through your school nurse. PCI, a universe unto itself, I'll just touch on it. If you accept payment for any goods or services by credit card, you are under the umbrella of the PCI, the payment card industry. The payment card industry is an entity created by the 4 major credit cards dominated by Visa. They have written rules and obligations called the PCI DSS regulations, and if you ever accept credit cards in your school store for tuition, for books, for shoulder pads and helmets, I don't know, whatever. If you accept credit cards, you must abide by PCI DSS regs, okay? And unauthorized access to payment card data puts you in the PCI universe, and you must demonstrate PCI compliance if you have unauthorized exposure of PCI, okay? So these, what I have on the board there, are the 3 big triggers for legal duties and obligations. You almost certainly have PII. And let me just touch on this as gently as I can. The biggest problem my educational clients have is that they store alumni data, okay? Unlike most of our merchant clients who don't, many of our educational clients have stored alumni data so that they can reach out to them, okay? And if you store that and it's accessed, you can discover, sometimes to your horror, that you have many years, or in some cases, many decades of student data that contains social security number or other PII. Unauthorized access to that data triggers notice, duties, and obligations. Okay? All right. And again, anybody has a question, shout it out. Okay? Data creates duties. If you have data, you may have duties. Okay? So if there's a compromise, you need to be able to get your fingertips on, what data do you collect and why? And I'm here to tell you that the great majority of our clients, frankly, don't exactly know what data they have and where it is. Whether they're blank academy, a small private school, or a major merchant with hundreds of stores across the United States. Invariably, our clients don't exactly know what they have and where it is because no one's ever actually tasked them with it. Okay? Where is it? Is it behind a firewall? Is it paper? Some states require notice of compromise of paper data, that's PII. Most data breach statutes only require notice obligations if there's the unauthorized exposure of digital PII. So digital is usually a protection. How well is it protected? Okay, is it encrypted? Is it not encrypted? Is it behind a firewall? Is your antivirus up to date? Who can access it? And here's a huge issue in the vast majority of our cases: who has admin credentials? Okay, who can get into your network and access PII? Do you have vendors to whom you have given admin credentials while they're doing work for your school? I'll give you a small, for instance, Target. Target was compromised because an HVAC contractor from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, was given temporary admin credentials into the Target network, notwithstanding the formidable security efforts and formidable security that Target had. Because an HVAC vendor had admin credentials into their system, they got compromised. So your cybersecurity is as strong as the cybersecurity of everybody who has elevated credentials. Are they former employees who still have admin credentials? Are they vendors that have admin credentials? Do you have default passwords? We represented a school that used PeopleSoft, and they thought they had disabled the default passwords. They did not. Anybody with reasonable skills in 5 minutes on the internet can find the default passwords for PeopleSoft. And there's a whole universe of folks out there who do nothing other than search the universe, including the educational universe, by use of default passwords to gain access, okay? What do you keep and how long do you keep it? If you remember one thing from what I say today, that's a good question to go home with. How long do we keep data, and do we need to keep it that long, okay? You may have a very good reason to keep alumni data. Contributions, contact, Thanksgiving football games, whatever. But if you're holding on to data for long periods of time for your alumni, you need to think long and carefully about who can access it and how secure it is, okay? And the failure to have a document destruction policy that is not only do you have it and implemented, can get you into serious trouble with regulators or, God forbid, plaintiff's attorneys, okay? There are 47 states in the union that have a data breach statute. Pennsylvania is among them. Pennsylvania is fortuitously not among the most vigorously enforced states when it comes to data breach, but that's all beginning to change. 2 or 3 years ago, we never heard from the Pennsylvania Attorney General, even if we reported that our clients had lost 1 million medical records or 3 million credit cards. We now hear from them somewhat regularly, okay? There has been constant talk in Washington about a unified data breach statute. President Obama has offered a executive order on that. One of these days, there'll be federal legislation on it. It's very hard to predict when it'll happen. But right now, there's a patchwork of 47 states, soon to be 48. And they sort of kind of look like this. And it essentially stands for the proposition that unauthorized access to PII will trigger notice obligations to affected individuals and sometimes to regulators, okay? We know the regulators that routinely call and follow up. There is no uniform requirement for credit monitoring. for instance. Say there's a compromise at your school, names and social security numbers, dates of birth, mother's maiden name is exposed. There's no legal requirement for credit monitoring, but I can tell you that if you don't offer credit monitoring, it's like extra bait on the hook for plaintiff's counsel, because it's one of the first things that they'll ask for is were the affected individuals given the benefit of credit monitoring, okay? So there is a de facto credit monitoring expectation out there. And if you went home and Googled tonight data compromises and looked at Targets and Home Depots or any of my clients, you will see 100% of them offer credit monitoring, okay? FERPA probably doesn't apply to you as much. FERPA is the federal legislation that requires notation of data compromise in educational institutions when there's an exposure, but of course that applies primarily to those educational institutions that receive federal funding. COPPA is, of course, the federal legislation that requires certain protections when websites target children. I can't imagine that that's too squared toward you. That's mostly for merchants, but I put these up here because there are federal statutes that will affect you in addition to the state statutes. I talked about HIPAA. I talked about PCI. The payment card industry and HIPAA, if you have medical records in a nurse's office that drags you into the HIPAA world, or if you take credit cards, that's something that you'll need to know about, okay? We talked about this, by the way. Alabama has a proposed data breach legislation on the books that'll probably happen this year. And notice what's happened here, because there's only 3 states left. California was first. There is essentially a uniform data compromise statute in the country. And what it has effectively become is the most demanding portion of each statute, okay? Because say one of your alumni for whom you have data exposed lives in California or Connecticut or Massachusetts. Those are the more demanding states when it comes to notice requirements. Are you really going to treat dissimilarly those that are similarly situated? Are you going to provide more notice or more credit monitoring to certain individuals because they live in a certain state? I can tell you that that is, again, extra bait on the hook for plaintiff's counsel in class action litigation, to the extent that you ever find yourself in that dark place. We represent many of our clients in the plaintiff's class action cases. So the bottom line is the state with the most demanding requirement for your affected pool becomes the de facto legal burden, or you're going to treat people dissimilarly, okay? Let me just talk briefly about what a breach response looks like, okay? We get a call from a school administrator. They say, Jim, to my horror, I just saw all of my students for the past 15 years, names, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, email addresses, home phone numbers posted on Paisboa, okay? And we have some fraudulent tax returns filed on behalf of some of our employees, okay? And we believe there's some identity theft which is associated with this exposure, okay? A not uncommon situation, okay? We've had that on behalf of many clients, including schools. What we then have to do, of course, is fix the compromise to make sure that whatever method of intrusion into your network is now closed, okay? And then we have to figure out the affected population, which is not always easy, and then provide notice to those folks, okay? And the notice requirements are driven by statute, okay? So you have to tell them within a certain period of time. If you have an alumni in Vermont, the Vermont Attorney General wants to know within 14 days of a data breach, okay? Florida is 30 days. Pennsylvania is without unreasonable delay. What does it mean? I don't know, but if you're going to notify Vermont in 14 days and you don't notify the Pennsylvania Attorney General, you may have some explaining to do. So we then take your affected population, figure out where they are, what data elements, mandatory data elements from the data breach statutes are triggered, and provide notice to those folks in a timely manner, consistent with the statute. we invariably will recommend some form of identity theft protection or credit monitoring. And again, not statutorily required, but if you don't do it, if you don't offer the credit monitoring, it substantially enhances the risk of litigation and regulatory censure. Okay? For instance, we routinely get letters from the Massachusetts Attorney General, Connecticut Attorney General saying, why didn't you offer 2 or 3 years of credit monitoring? To which we say it's not required under your statute. They say, do it anyway. And if we don't comply, quite frankly, they can demand remediation of you, which is punitive, in my opinion, because it's expensive, it's difficult, and it requires substantial reporting obligations. So we try very hard, and we hear from the same attorneys general again and again, to get along with them on behalf of our clients. You know, what can be done? Obviously, you know, the best way to handle or prepare yourself for data breach response is to have decent security. Okay, but as Mark said, we've represented clients that employ armies of data security experts, and they get compromised. Okay, the FBI has been hacked, the CIA has been hacked, Boeing's been hacked. And I'm sure everybody knows this, your website is probed by automated tools constantly. If you have an external facing website, you're constantly being probed, okay? And so the fact that you haven't been compromised is a credit to you, because obviously you've defeated the auto attackers out there, okay? But if you ever find yourself in a position where you have PII, protected data, exposed to unauthorized users, attackers, whatever, hackers, disgruntled students, former employees, the best thing you can say to a regulator or a plaintiff's attorney is, we had a plan for data security, we had a budget for data security. Over time, the budget went up. Here's what we did, here's what we didn't do, here's why we didn't do that, but here's why we did this. And we tell a story on behalf of our clients. And to the extent that your story makes sense and is reasonable given your budget restraints, not everybody is Boeing, right? That's a story that makes sense to regulators. We can, with great regularity, satisfy regulatory inquiry on behalf of our clients. Plaintiffs' counsel are, of course, a different story, all right, because plaintiffs' counsel are interested in attorney's fees and a little more difficult to satisfy. But if you have unauthorized exposure of protected data, you can be sued for that exposure. The defense bar, or defense attorneys, have been very, very successful in defeating 99% of the litigation out there for identity theft or some form of claim for damages. However, the name of the game for plaintiffs' counsel is, regrettably, but not unexpectedly, settlement. Okay? So it's not the jury verdict they want or expect, because frankly, we're pretty good about getting these cases dismissed, but getting there can be a long, arduous, and expensive task. Okay? So what else can be done? There are obviously a host of things. Preventive in nature, as Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So as much preventative measures as you can afford to do, as you can think about doing, and then can demonstrate in the event of a compromise is very helpful. Jamie, I think this is yours.
Morning, everybody. I'm a GFS grad, so I know a lot about independent schools. Proud to be a grad from an independent school. I want to talk a little bit today about a privacy mindset and dialogue that needs to go on at your organizations. Times have really changed. I know most kids don't even know what a busy sound on a telephone is anymore. There's a new Barbie doll that's coming out by Mattel where the child talks to the doll. The doll picks up what the child's saying by Wi-Fi, shoots it up to the cloud, analyzes it with data analytics, and the Barbie doll talks back to the child based on what the analytics determine is that child's preferences. So you can imagine how this raises all kinds of ethical issues, privacy issues, and concerns. Technology has really revolutionized education, but we also need to be constantly mindful of privacy and the significant risks and inaccuracies and biases that can occur with the collection, warehousing, and use of children's private information. And this is why I want to suggest to everybody here that your schools and administrators and teachers need to approach technology with what I call a privacy by design mindset. And this is not just an IT issue. This is a mindset that everybody in your school at all levels, whether it be the board level, the teachers, the administrators, in communication with IT, need to start thinking about. A lot of times there's a disconnect between IT and technology, budgeting, and how data and privacy need to be approached. And all of these entities need to come together to really cut down on human error or surprises or these kinds of mistakes that we've heard about are one of the main reasons why there are breaches and litigation and sanctions by attorneys general and all of those types of things. One great thing I think all independent schools can do is have and create a data governance team. I'm not talking about the technical people, because it's not just the technical people. Those technical people need to report that aspect of it. But it needs to be a team of administrators, at the higher level, board people that can brainstorm, that can create policies. And this can be constantly updated on a regular basis as things change in the world, as there's new types of issues that come up. I know we were just talking to one of your colleagues who said there's a new app where there's all kinds of awful information being posted anonymously on this app about specific schools and targeting specific schools. These are the kinds of things that should be regularly discussed at a data governance team meeting. And where there is a thinking through of what types of technology the school is using, how it's being used, what are the risks. Things like, we've talked a little bit about FERPA and COPPA and HIPAA. Those are federal statutes that actually can provide standards of care, even if you don't necessarily trigger that specific statute if you don't accept federal funding, but there's, students' privacy bills of rights. I mean, these are the expectations that are going to be had in litigation, where students have expectation of their information not being passed on to marketers, through the school process. So again, these are all kinds of things that need to be thought about. And I think when it comes to use of information from the students or use of your information that you collect at your schools outside the organization, one of the things that a committee on data security can think about is making sure that there's a uniform policy. In other words, it's not just certain teachers pulling down a cool new app and using it, and you don't necessarily know what the privacy policy of that app is or what private information is being collected. So there should be a uniform procedure at the school to decide what technology is going to be used, what apps, what outside electronic material those teachers can use at a high level, and that be an approved piece of technology. So there was a uniform analysis of, how it's going to affect the students. And that information of what apps and technology you're using can be posted on your website, so parents have access to it. There's certain circumstances where schools can, if it's purely for educational purposes, can give consent to the use of that private information of the students in those apps or technology. But a lot of times parental consent is required. And sometimes, especially if it's information being sent outside to outside third-party vendors for apps, it's better just to put the notice out there, let parents know you're using it, get consent, rather than have it backfire and find out a third-party vendor or app is misusing information in a way you weren't aware of. When it comes to using information inside the organization, again, there has to be an analysis of, we talked a little bit about it, appropriate levels of access. Not everybody should have access within your organization to all of the information. It should be segmented off. So if you're collecting private information for students, that's something that needs to be analyzed and segmented off by department. Obviously not everybody should have access to the health information or the grade information in the school. Obviously there's considerations on how long to store it, use of portable media. All of these kinds of discussions and analysis can reduce the risk of human error. One of the big things that's happening now is, there's a big prohibition on schools allowing students' private information to be used or sold for marketing. Just move up a little bit. Am I going the wrong way? Sorry. A lot of these free apps that you use will collect and save the information from your students and then use it for marketing to them. And this can violate your own school's privacy policy. And again, this is why any third-party entity that you deal with, you need to be very aggressive in, knowing what the privacy policy is, figuring out if you need consent beyond just an analysis within the school. Do you need parental consent? You also should ask third-party vendors you are dealing with to take certain standards of care. They should have a remediation plan if there is a breach. And these are the kinds of things that school administrators can ask for third-party vendors that they deal with. They can also require that the third-party vendor notify the school immediately if the third-party vendor has a breach of your students' information. Where your students' information is released. These are the kinds of things that you can negotiate in your contracts. Make sure that the contracts with third-party vendors aren't one-sided to their favor, that they can lose any of your information on their end, but yet the school is left holding the bag and responsible for it. These are the kinds of things that you really need to be aware of, have discussion about, take some time to review those contracts and make these demands to the third-party vendors. There's some great checklists here that I have links to at the bottom of my PowerPoint slide, and we can share them with anybody that wants them. But it's a great way to start this discussion and dialogue at your schools. It's not like you have to buy a high-powered firewall or anything like that. It's about communication. It's about thinking through. It's about a privacy by design mindset. So you don't just get carried away with technology and say, oh, great, this is a Barbie doll that's going to talk back to my child. Isn't this great? Because all of a sudden, your child's personal thoughts and private discussions are out there in the cloud and are being analyzed by someone that determine analytics of what, of certain assumptions on what your child's saying and feeding that child back information that they think is pertinent to your child. So these are the kinds of things and the kinds of thought processes and discussion that every school can have, big or small. So I would encourage everybody to start thinking with a privacy by design mindset. Ready? Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Falk, and I am an insurance broker with the Willis Group. For those of you unfamiliar with the Willis Group, we are a global insurance broker. We do place the largest amount of cyber liability insurance in the country, and it's something that we have been doing for some time. And so you've heard about the threats that are out there, and what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is what we can do from an insurance standpoint to protect you if in fact a breach does occur, if in fact you are the subject of a third-party lawsuit. What we'll look at today are the types of insurance coverages available for cyber liability insurance coverage, as well as some sublimits and perhaps some restrictions, and then talk a little bit about the marketplace and how it's evolved, how it continues to evolve, and it is very much a fluid marketplace at this time. So within the cyber liability policies, you're going to have two different types of coverages. There'll be first-party coverages that are payable to your organization, and then third-party coverages that will be part of any lawsuit that may come in from an outside third party. The very first coverage that I've listed here are the breach expenses. So what happens when you have a breach? Has anyone actually been through a breach claim or had the displeasure, I'll say, of dealing with it? Well, it's good. It's a positive thing. But for those of you who may have been through another claim, through another type of coverage, you know that it can be a daunting process. And one of the major advantages to having a privacy and network security liability policy in place is that you get access to a carrier that's able to help you with these breach expenses almost immediately. So this is going to cover anything that has to do with notification to the individuals. It's going to cover forensics. It's going to cover compliance with initial privacy. And it's also going to provide you with any PR, public relations, that you may need as a result of a breach. You see these breaches happen. They usually do hit the newspapers. So you may want to be able to respond proactively given the fact that there is press out there and you are being notified. Cyber extortion, if in fact you are the victim of any third party who wants to shut down your system or shut off your system, this will pay for costs and other expenses due to that type of threat. Restoration costs. If you have a data breach and that breach results in any sort of loss of data, and that could be either through a virus or malicious code, this is the coverage that will help to either restore or recollect the data and put everything back in place. And the last coverage would be internet business interruption. So more of an exercise in accounting. If you do have online business operations, the business interruption coverage will provide costs to you for any money that you would have lost due to your network being down. Third-party coverages, privacy and network security liability. These two go somewhat hand in hand. These are the coverages that are going to trigger if you are sued by a third party due to either loss of data or a breach of data. And the way I like to distinguish the two is privacy liability is going to cover you if, in fact, you have someone who loses the laptop on the subway or on the taxi. You don't necessarily have to have a breach per se, just lost data. Whereas network security liability is what's going to cover you in the event that your system or your network is breached and that someone did get in and also transmits any sort of malicious code, things of that nature. Within these coverages are also regulatory proceedings. So a few of the other panelists talked about what would happen from states and how they're going to respond. If you are the target of any regulatory action, you will have coverage for the proceedings, usually within the privacy or the network security liability. Media liability. This covers you for any online media that you may have, copyright or trademark, infringement of privacy, libel, slander, things of that nature. It's going to cover you for anything on your website, and it can also be expanded to websites that you control. Social media is very big these days, so if you have a Twitter feed or you have any LinkedIn or anything on Facebook, this can be expanded to cover you in the event that anything on those pages happen to infringe a trademark or infringe privacy. And then the last piece is not always part of your cyber liability, but it can be included here. It is your technology errors and omissions. So if you are doing anything on a technology front, creating your own software, that could be educational or otherwise, programming, if you have a component that can be wrapped into this, it can also be addressed separately. Really a matter of personal preference. Each of these policies will have sublimits and they will have restrictions. Some of the standard policy terms that we see will always include your privacy and network security liability and your data breach. So if you go out and buy a cyber liability policy, you're going to have those coverages. The rest do tend to be add-on, some for minimal premium, some can cost a little more, and that's going to depend on your individual exposures. Going back to the data breach costs, which is the amount that you're going to have to pay for those notification expenses, the carriers have created this type of coverage to result in two different ways. Some carriers will be able to provide you with notification costs outside your privacy and network security liability limit, which means that if you have a data breach, any costs that you incur to provide notification to the individuals will not impact the amount of liability limits you have available should a third-party breach come in down the road. And that's very important. It's keeping a tower of dry powder, so to speak, in the event a claim comes later on. The carriers do this because a lot of times if they can get a handle right away and they can get immediate notification out, get to these individuals as fast as possible, it really does cut down on any third-party claims on the back end. So as quickly as you know about the breach or even a potential breach, it's important to let your carrier know that something may have happened or something has happened so that we can get the ball rolling. Regulatory proceedings are usually covered within your privacy. They are usually sublimited, so you will have that coverage. It's not always up to your full limit of liability. So important to know that if you do have a sublimited regulatory limit, what that number is, and perhaps look at any potential fines and penalties so you can increase or decrease, especially if it's something you're being charged for. The internet media, the cyber extortion, business interruption, and data restoration all vary by carrier. This still is a relatively new coverage in the marketplace. By relatively new, we'll say the past 10 years or so. So it's very rare to see two insurance carriers that offer the same language on their policy forms. It does make it somewhat of a difficult task, but with the right broker, we're here to help you, and we're here to walk you through that process so you understand what each carrier is providing for you. As a broker, I'll look at these coverages and I'll look at the clients to determine what is necessary if you do have the exposure, and if so, to talk about how much each of these coverages will cost. Because if you truly do not have one of these types of exposures or it's addressed in another area, we want to make sure we know that and identify that so you're not paying for things you don't need. PCI coverage, the payment card industry, is not always included, and that's an important fact. So if you are doing transactions at the bookstore or anything with any payment card, it's important to identify, are you covered for this? And if so, for how much? Because it usually is a sublimit. The next slide, some statistics, trends, and developments in the marketplace. It's a very active marketplace, I think, as you all know. It's hard to go even a week without seeing a new breach or some sort of potential breach. So the past year has really changed the cyber pricing and terms and condition environment, especially for some of our hotter areas, whether that's retail or financial institutions, certainly healthcare. But for other classes of business, the market really does remain stable for now. And I think that's an important message because it only takes one large or a couple within the industry for carriers and the marketplace to really start to scrutinize everything that's going on. We continue to see the high-profile losses as well as regulatory actions increasing, which again all creates more of a demand, closer underwriting from the markets, and really the need to identify truly how many records you have access to and what controls are in place on the front end to prevent hacks or breaches from happening. Another trend we're seeing is the capacity. And by capacity, I mean how much the carriers are willing to give to their clients. And I think in the industry we're all dealing with here today, the educational space capacity does remain stable. So it really is not an issue. But what we are seeing is in other higher target marketplaces, capacity shrinking, where carriers would have given 10 million in limits, now they're only giving 5. If they were only giving 5, now they're giving 2 or 3. So it's part of the identification process that I think is important to go through to determine what's the right limit for you and for your school. Overall, when we do have cyber policies in place and they're coming up for renewal, even the best accounts with great price, with great controls and everything in place still are seeing 5% increases in their renewals. And that's just a target of the marketplace. For accounts that aren't so good, maybe they don't have the controls, or maybe they have had a breach, it's not uncommon to see 15 to 25% increase. There's stable pricing offerings within this market, but we're no longer seeing carriers buying business anymore. Even a couple years ago, I was seeing some ridiculously low pricing on this type of coverage, really unsustainable. And it was the result of new carriers trying to get into the marketplace, essentially undercutting their competitors to get the business on the books. And we're really not seeing that anymore. Regardless of industry, I think the carriers have now come to a point where they realize that there is exposure no matter what your industry is, and that it's no longer sustainable to keep that low pricing in place. And so we continue to push them, and they continue to push back. But our goal is to always maintain the best coverage and pricing for you. As a relatively new coverage, the terms and conditions do vary, but all forms, all dedicated cyber liability forms do have the ability to address all of the coverages that we talked about here today. And then another important point is that we're seeing more exclusions being added onto your other lines of coverage. So your general liability, your crime, your directors and officers. There's been claims that have come in the past that have kind of snuck their way into these other lines of coverage. And the carriers are recognizing this, and they're saying, well, our policy over here was never designed to pick that up. We want to push this over to the cyber liability coverage. And so not only is it important to look at what's going on in your cyber policy, but keep an eye out on all your other lines, because we are seeing general liability exclusions and crime and directors and officers. And so it's important that if it's being excluded in one area, it's being picked up here where it's designed to be. And then the retentions, or your deductible, what you have to pay out of pocket first. Due to the breaches, the higher frequency, the higher severity, we are seeing an increase in these retentions or deductibles. Whereas a couple years ago, it wasn't uncommon for small clients to see $1,000 or $5,000 as their retention. Today, $25,000 is more realistic. And for larger entities, it gets even higher. So certainly not abnormal at renewal if you have a policy in place to see not only a 5% pricing increase, but perhaps a little bit of bump in retention as well. That's all on my end. I'll hand it back over to Al.
Thank you. Let's see. I think perhaps before we have lunch, it's a good time for questions from the audience. Everybody's pretty quiet, and I don't know if that means you're stunned. I have at least one question for them and Mary, because I think it's really important to understand. Some of you are in the we used to call it the Paisboa program, our property and casualty insurance program, but I want to be sure that you have in mind the standards that have been set for that program in particular and how it works, because obviously insurance is an important part of the strategy for dealing with the inherent risks, as well as a bunch of internal stuff. So, Mary or Ben, would you mind addressing the Paisboa policy and how it works, what the limits are, and what you've designed into the package for our schools? You want to speak here or at the mic? Either way.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I guess we are now. My name is Mary Williams. I am also with Willis. I work in the same office that Ben works in, but I am in a different department. I do property and casualty, and I also work with the Paisboa program, which is the insurance consortium for Paisboa. We do have and have had for the last couple of years an endorsement on our directors and officers policy with Great American. It is a network security and privacy endorsement, and it does provide many of the coverages that Ben talked about in his presentation. We do have the third-party liability coverage for network injury and privacy injury. We also have the first-party notification fund that would cover first-party notification expenses if you're required to notify people whose information has been compromised. We'll also provide the credit monitoring we talked about and the forensics investigations. So it provides both of those, the third party, the first party, and also there's a supplement for regulatory action if you are investigated by the Attorney General and need to respond to that kind of an investigation. The big advantage, I think, to our members is that limit, that endorsement is included as part of the directors and officers policy for a very, very minimal premium, a couple $100s, where when you're looking at a standalone policy that you might buy in the marketplace, Ben, and maybe you can, if my guess is wrong here, correct me, but I think we're looking probably at a minimum premium of $5,000, and it probably goes up from there.
I think it may be even more. I think it may rival what the premium for the directors and officers is currently, if you're looking at it from a premium standpoint.
Okay, great, thanks. The other big advantage, I think, to the members is the fact that everybody had access to this endorsement automatically and did not have to go through an underwriting process. So there wasn't a need to fill out a long application. You didn't have to prove that you had certain procedures and processes in place already in order to qualify for the coverage. So I think that answers your question, Al, for regarding the insurance and what we have in place.
Thank you. I think that was a pretty important issue because it is all about our schools, for our schools, in a program that has been designed for it. No matter what you're doing or how you're doing it, you want to be able to perhaps make that comparison along the way. Emily?
Repeat my question. I'd like to know who here has a data governance team and who is on it?
Following the earlier question, the question is who in the room has a data policy breach kind of team in place? This idea that there might be a group in the school community that is paying some attention to this subject. Anybody have one or started one? Even the most advanced heads in the room are saying no, maybe not yet. I don't know. That depends on how you feel about our work today.
I'd like to just add something to that point, which is, it's an important discussion to have, not just at an IT level, but as we talked about at an administrative and board level, twofold, obviously for the internal dialogue, brainstorming, and thought process, and coordination of procedures and policies. But also, if there ever is an issue, it's very important to be able to demonstrate that the board was briefed on these things regularly, that at an administrative level, this was discussed. Even if there is, a breach or a mistake made, to be able to defend your actions by saying, we did everything we could. It wasn't just the IT person and we didn't put enough money into that budget, but we really analyzed this whole thing, and here's our minutes from the board meeting, and here's the minutes of our committee, and this is what was presented, every quarter of the year or whatever. So it's a really important thing on a lot of levels.
Yeah, can I add to that? I can't overstate the importance of that. The truth of the matter is there used to be precious little litigation because there were never jury rewards or awards on behalf of plaintiffs. Now there are more and more of them because there are more settlements. And now they've spawned D&O litigation. So the truth of the matter is the big data breach cases now not only see class action suits filed by affected parties seeking monetary damages, there are D&O suits which essentially allege that the officers or trustees of a school took insufficient action to protect the protected data of the students and alumni. It's an allegation easily made and difficult to refute, okay? It rolls right off plaintiff counsel's fingertip. The best way to respond to that is we have a board, as Jamie suggested. They meet, fill in the blanks, quarterly, twice a year, annually. Here are the minutes. Here's who attended. Here's the action items. The budget was increased. We focused on new antivirus. We focused on limiting the number of those with administrative access. We had everybody check off that no default passwords were still in place, yada, yada, yada. That takes much of the air out of both litigation that can follow a data compromise and regulatory scrutiny from attorneys general. So it's a great way to protect yourself.
My group also handles executive liability for Willis as well, meaning the directors and officers. And so to those 2 points, we are seeing it more and more because of the personal responsibility that goes along with board members. So being able to say that you have contemplated it, you have controls in place, will go a long way in terms of dealing with the regulatory actions.
more and more schools are handing out devices for students to use. Could you discuss some of the liabilities involved in that approach? When it's a school-owned device and the students can take it home?
Yeah, I'll go first. Anybody can jump in. Here's one, there's no simple answer. Two, the data statutes are new. Three, here's the answer, okay? The entity that receives the data that is compromised. So if the data that's compromised is privileged data or confidential data, name and social security number, name and grades, which is not definitional PII, but highly sensitive. If the original recipient of that data is the school, most attorneys general will say that the notice responsibilities under the statutes fall to the school, even if the data was exposed by way of a lost or misplaced device given to a student. There is not uniformity, there's not legal uniformity among the states in that, but there are many states that expressly take that position. It doesn't matter which individual or entity lost the device or had it stolen or intentionally exposed it. It's the entity which originally gathered the data. I can't help but suspect that in your cases, it's probably your school, if it's data that you're worried about. Does that address your question, sir? Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I would just add sort of a little different or additional aspect to that, which is, my kids are all, have one-on-one laptops since middle school. And kids can go on the internet, obviously, wherever they want and download any apps on the school device. However, and I don't think you're responsible for that. But what you are responsible for is, the school approved and recommended apps that your teachers ask your students to use. And then, in our schools, like we use Haiku and VeraCross and, all these different programs. And again, it gets back to, we can get really excited about technology, and there's so many cool, amazing things. But you can't just have, teachers and whoever they want saying to the kid, download this app, do that. A lot of these apps collect kids' private information and then market to them. And that's a violation, potential violation for the school. So again, there should be that higher level committee, team that says, these are the approved school apps. This is the list of them on our school website. If you need to get consent and put that notice out to parents, just say, these are the apps that our students are going to be using this year. We want the parents to consent to them. Make sure you have a sense of what the privacy policy are of those apps, and that they don't collect children's private information and then market back to them unbeknownst to you. Again, a high-level, thought-out process, and it shouldn't be daunting, and communicate with your teachers and your administrators and say, you just can't go and grab whatever you want here, even though it sounds cool. We have a procedure. If you want to use an app, send it in. Our committee will look at it. Have a procedure in place to have an organized approach, privacy by design mindset.
My question has to do with student information systems that are in the cloud. Let's say you have one, you've had one for a number of years. You decide to switch and go with a whole nother company. So what is your liability with the data that's in the cloud service at company A, but now you're actually going to company B? Do you have to get some kind of self-destruct document that they don't have that data anymore? Or, what position does that put the school in when a company goes out of business, or you move to a different company?
That's a great question. It's a good and thoughtful question, and we see more and more and more of that, okay? It used to be that all of our educational clients had their data stored in paper, in a file, in the basement somewhere, okay? Nowadays, it's in the cloud, all right? And so the simplest, narrowest answer to your question is, what does your contract say? Okay, what legal duties, rights, and obligations are articulated in the contract between you and your vendors, your cloud providers? I'm here to tell you that I have multi-billion-dollar corporation clients that have no articulation of those legal duties, rights, and responsibilities. Nobody thought about them. Their contractual obligation is essentially an invoice with some form language on the back. Okay, so the simplest and best answer is, look at what your contract says. And I think the best thing you can do for yourself is actually looking forward wherever you put your data, okay? Whatever vendor, whatever cloud provider, articulate in those contracts who's responsible for what happens if you switch vendors, why, how, and who pays for it. The responsibility between you and your vendors is largely contractual, okay? And to get back to this gentleman's question, to tie those two together, the truth of the matter is many of our clients don't have that specific articulation in the contract. The statutes are essentially ambiguous on the issue. I can tell you that regulators and plaintiffs' attorneys will hold you responsible if there's an exposure. Okay? If they have to choose between an active, ongoing educational institution, perhaps with an endowment, which they'll be sure to articulate in paragraph 3 of the complaint, or a defunct or near defunct cloud provider, you know who the target is. Okay? But it's a great question, and look at your contract and make sure your contracts say that in the event or the termination of this contract by you, by us, or for any reason, you hereby promise that you will do the following in terms of data return or data destruction, and that those costs are borne by you, and in the event you don't do it, liquidated damages are bang, and then you can protect yourself.
And Jim, if I can
Sir.
add to that, to your question, Miss, we have seen contracts that specifically say if once we leave your service, you agree to hand back all of our data and verify that you in fact deleted everything from your network. We've seen that in writing. And to the other gentleman's question about, school-owned devices, I'm going to send Bob Sager and Al an example policy, bring your own device policy, that is very prevalent in corporate America, and it might be something you guys could borrow some ideas from. So I'll send that to the group.
And contractually as well, we work on a number of large Fortune 500 companies that go into cloud services, and even they cannot negotiate out of these indemnity provisions that we're seeing that essentially push all the indemnity back to you. So if they can't do it, it's extremely unlikely a small school is going to be able to do it. So it's important that you do know what indemnity provisions are there, and that's what makes buying a policy, such as a cyber policy, so important, because then you do have the coverage in place, not relying on any indemnity that may not be there from your cloud computing service.
Two questions. First one is the PII is, so let's say we have a database where we have, or a spreadsheet that's on the development office's computer, name and address of alums. Is that something we need to worry about? Is that, because that to me doesn't seem like that much private information, right? So at what level does this sort of play into this issue? That's the first part of the question.
Let me answer the first and easiest question.
Yeah.
No. Okay? Name and address or nothing. It's phone book stuff. Okay? And let me just give you a tight definition of as PI as I can, a workable definition, because there are 47 states. They all have slightly different permutations. And at least one of the statutes says that data which, when collected and looked at in the aggregate, can help an identity thief engage in identity theft. Ugh. But the simplest answer, kryptonite, is name and social security number, okay? Think unique identifiers, okay? So name and social security number is the paradigm. Driver's license number, okay? Name and driver's license number, unique. It's a unique identifier. Think identity theft. What would an identity thief want in order to file a fraudulent tax return? Okay, we must have gotten 40 new cases in the past month from clients where their data has been stolen and fraudulent tax returns have been filed. It's an epidemic. What do you need for that? You need a name. You need a social security number. If you have other stuff like children's names, it helps. Okay, but the tightest, the most workable definition of PII, it's got to have a name, because you could sit right down at the table right there and start writing out the right number of digits for social security numbers. It's somebody's social. Without a name, it's useless. So it's name and social, it's name and driver's license number, and then you have to think a little more broadly to the extent that you don't have social security number. If you have a whole bunch of data, wife's name, wife's maiden name, children's names, birth dates, address, username and password is now PII in California. Okay? So And again, you think, well, we're not in California. You have an alumni move to California, and their username and password is in your database. You have definitional PII. And if you're going to cherry pick 3 of them and provide them notice, not everybody else, that might be the right idea given the facts. It might not be. So I don't want to overstate it or spook you. PII is still fairly tight to name and unique identifier, think social, but definitional PII is a ratchet that turns one way. The definition has constantly gotten broader and broader and broader, and California is the most progressive state when it comes to definition, okay? And they just changed their definition to include name, to include username and password, okay? And lots of institutions have username and passwords, including many educational institutions.
I think I would just add one thing, too. I mean, there's the obvious, technical breach, but there's also the reputational embarrassment. If you have people's salaries, or you have, like, who's the good donors and who's the not, or the gold list, and that gets out, or whatever, so there is that reputational aspect to private information, too, that you have to be mindful of.
Although a lot of that's published in our annual report, which is available on our website, so I understand. I get that there's this fine. That's why I was trying to get that line of where, because we have a lot of those kinds of things that go out and are on people's computers, whereas our more detailed data is protected or behind a firewall or behind password. So just trying to get a better understanding.
Let me pile on to Jamie's point, which is a great one. Jamie's been talking mostly about big stuff that's really important to you. I've sort of focused on what you have to do pursuant to the statute. We've had many educational clients where it had a list of donors, Joe Schmidt, $5 million endowment, blah, 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 and it doesn't have his social security number, it doesn't have his driver's license number, so it's not definitional PII. But the question then falls to you, do you tell Joe Smith, $5 million donor, or do you not tell him? If you're looking at the statute, which is what I've focused on, and if you say, Jim, do I have a legal duty and obligation to tell him, and it's just, if it's just name and an amount given and an address, the answer is no. Jamie would tell you right away, and I would too if you asked me, you better think long and hard about not telling him, because if your donor base finds out and your contributors find out that their data was exposed and the amount given was exposed, and my guess is your donors don't want it known, or they'll be besieged with other spam or attempts to seek money from them, it's probably a really good idea to tell them. It's not necessary or compulsory under the statute, which means you don't have to offer them credit monitoring or anything like that, but it's probably a really good idea to do it. So I couldn't agree more with Jamie's point.
So my second goes to the insurance coverage, and what would you say you're seeing as the amount, right? The right sort of amount for independent schools in the size of our school group and the types of schools. So sort of the coverage amount that you think is the ballpark right now.
Sure. I think that what's been set up so far as an endorsement to the D&O policy certainly is a great start in terms of sharing a $1 million limit. I think as you deal with growth and as the industry matures even more, we are seeing the $1 million limit as a starting point, with those other schools perhaps going to as high as 3 or even 5, depending on their size. And with that, I think what's more important is to focus on the actual coverage within the limit. So what are we looking to insure? How many of those insuring clauses are we adding? And then for the coverages that are sublimited, how can we maximize that? Can we get full regulatory coverage? Can we get data breach costs outside the limit to the point where you're enhancing that even more? So I guess the short answer would be it's usually $1 million start for a first-time purchaser, and it can go up from there depending on if, in fact, there has been a breach or even potential breach, because that certainly opens eyes of individuals.
I totally agree with that. Let me just ask you a question, though, in response. How much data do you have? If you have 50 years of alumni data, then you might want to go this way. If you don't retain alumni data, then you can go that way.
I wanted to add into a couple of things back here, sorry. With regard to kind of tie this back into many of you from the school perspective, some of the things that Jim and Jamie and Mark had mentioned. One about the contract, and somebody had asked about the student information systems. any of those contracts, whether it's with Blackbaud, Senior Systems, RenWeb, any of them, when a contract is written, it's written in the best interest of who wrote the contract. Keep that in mind whenever you're signing into an agreement. Second is, no contract that comes from a vendor is ever locked in stone. They want your business. They're going to work with you to try and write that contract that will meet your requirements. And everything that Jim outlined is perfectly true. Make sure you have everything stated about where your data is at all times, when you will get it, or what you will get back. And one thing I don't know if you mentioned was when. Define the exact parameters of when you expect to have that data either completely cleansed or returned to you once you end the agreement. It's very important. And it goes beyond the student information systems. It goes into to all the systems that you have, either internally or especially outside, including learning management systems. This is one that a lot of schools overlook on this kind of thing. You may think of, and those of you who don't know what a learning management system is, it's a system that the schools use and many of the teachers and students communicate with one another. Sometimes it's tied into your website. Sometimes it's tied into your student information system. But either way, that's just another component where data is shared. And you have very little control over that because it's open where the students, teachers, parents communicate with one another. The last thing I mentioned about the websites is another important part. That's one where you have information coming in and out of the website, mostly in from parents information being posted, re-enrollments, new enrollments, inquiries, all of these different things. Again, you have very little control of what's coming into that because they're going to enter information in. You have to look at all of that very carefully and make sure that the contract you have in place covers what you have in there. The other part that I had mentioned, and I think Jamie had mentioned about the idea of, Al had asked who here has a panel in place. One of the things I would recommend is immediately put your technology person on your safety committee. How many of you have safety committees in your school? How many of you have the technology person on your safety committee? One person. Absolutely, that person should be on your safety committee because a large percentage of the safety involved at your school isn't somebody tripping on the bad concrete out front. It's somebody dealing with technology. So make sure they're a part of it, and that will start to include some of these things that were being discussed before. That's a very important part, and it's a committee that already exists, so it's not something you have to start from scratch. And the last thing I won't leave you with is make sure that you have something in place dealing with business continuity. We talk about it as, often you'll hear as a disaster recovery. We like to refer to it as academic and administrative continuity. What are you going to do in the case of a situation when something happens at the school? This kind of a situation becomes a disaster. Jim, I'm sure you can anybody up there can attest. This isn't a fire, this isn't a flood, but it's as big of a disaster as any of those could ever be. So you have to have something in place that says, this person does this person does this is the only person that speaks to media, this is the only person that speaks to our faculty and staff, speaks to our parents. All those need to be put in place in a good disaster recovery or continuity plan. So I just want to mention that for everybody.
I just want to clarify on apps for a second. It seems to me you're like referring to apps that kids download themselves that ask for all the pertinent information, address, phone number, things like that. Whereas we look at it from more of a school-based app situation where our school has a subscription to a service. Our kids put in a username and a password that's unique to the school, but doesn't really provide any information about the kid, although maybe occasionally we'll say, use your birthday as your password. What is do you understand the difference I'm trying to ascertain here? Because I understand your point. Obviously, if a kid downloads an app and puts in all this personal information, that's a problem. Is it a problem if we have a school-based Google Doc site?
Yeah, that's a good question because it is the technology of all of these apps are very complicated. A lot of these apps collect information about the child without necessarily being because they put in their social or their date of birth. It might be, analyzing what they're putting into the app or their preferences, and then they use data analytics, and then they can market. All of a sudden the child goes somewhere else on the internet and information collected in that app gets shot back to that child for marketing purposes. The whole COPPA statute deals with this. So any app that a school is using, needs to have a discussion, with that app provider, are you collecting or using any or analyzing anything this child is doing within the app for marketing? No, you can't do that. It's one thing if it's used just for the functioning of the app itself or within the app, but beyond that, they can't sell that child's information or preferences, whether, boy, girl, do you like dogs, do you like chocolate or vanilla ice cream, or whatever it is. And then secondly, I think it's, in a prophylactic way, it's very good to have an approved list of apps, at that administrative level that the school will use, not ad hoc. And then, let the parents know what those apps are that your school is going to be using, and say, like, if here's the links to the app and the privacy policy. If anybody has an issue, you have an opportunity to consent or issue that you don't want your child using this app, and then you kind of have a lot of stuff covered. And again, the links, some of the links I provided you in my slide and some materials that Mark can provide, it'll give you guys, it sounds like a lot of information from everybody right now, but it'll start to provide checklists that can form the discussion points that you're going to want to be having in your safety group, or whatever data security group you want to create. And you can start to work your way through these things and get, once these things are sort of in place and you have a structure, it becomes a lot easier because now, you might add 1 app a year or 2 app a year to your list and it's already formulated. You're going to already have your list of what you want to ask vendors, like, they need to notify you in 5 days if they lose your students' information. They can't retain your information beyond 30 days after they go out of business or you don't use them anymore. All that stuff is already going to be in the can, if you will, and you just need to start to, and then periodically you update it and revisit it and have the discussion and keep thinking about it. And I think, with apps, that's the same kind of thing. And it's not as overwhelming as you think as you start to break it down and get these structures in place.
If I could add one thing to your app question, sir. So there's a company we often work with. They're located in Harrisburg called ICSA Labs, and they're owned by Verizon. And I've spoke on some panels like this with the one gentleman there. It's super interesting, this whole mobile app world. The amount of risks, there's malicious risks, but there's also these unintentional things that are happening. What was interesting, he pointed out the guys who make those apps for all kind of companies are so spread out now. They're not really big companies. They tend to be small shops. They use a lot of free, what's called coding libraries out there. Some of those coding libraries are malicious to begin with, right? ICSA Labs test mobile apps for all kind of companies. They show a lot of them are putting cookies and things like that on your device, whether it's an iPad, and basically checking your calendar, checking your contacts list. They're doing a lot of things that you weren't intended as part of the app. So I think there's some risk to that. Whether Google Docs, I doubt that. Google's a big company, but it's a little different, right?
We'll get the mic right to you. And how many of you are using Google Apps now? I see just an increasing trend to that. And I guess I have some concern about how much any individual school can influence the kind of documents that they put out, that you either take it or leave it.
Right.
I'll just touch very briefly on it, and again, not to be the bearer of bad news. They're the bear and you're not the bear. So it's hard to win the fight with the bear. Google Apps, I've seen Google Apps refuse to produce documents pursuant to subpoenas issued by state grand juries and the FBI. They will resist giving you anything they don't want to give you, okay? On the other hand, you are their customer, but they have thousands or millions of customers, some of whom are extremely large. So your ability to negotiate with Google, I would never overstate. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look very, very carefully at what you're buying or what you're allowing your students to access. But your ability to negotiate with Google, I think I share, Ben's position that it's very hard to do.
I think one of the important things, though, obviously with the Google Docs, most schools use them, and and there is more controls in place at an organization of that size. But it makes you mindful on your committee, don't just use any crazy app that's out there. The little guys, that's where your real problem are going to be. So, yeah, maybe you can't move the bear, but don't just have a teacher go and grab any app that they want without thinking it through, without having, an approved list, a procedure in place, and, links for the parents, not, notice to the parents. I think it goes a long way to approach it in an organized way and stick with maybe the more established things or carefully vet the smaller ones if you're going to use them.
My question is about PCI compliance. So we don't host our website on site, so we don't process our credit cards on site. We use a third party to handle that. Does that mean that that our systems have to be PCI compliant because credit card numbers could be flowing through our network?
Yes. If you look at PCI DSS regs, they apply to any entity out there that processes or accepts credit card data. Okay, it's the broadest possible definition. Having said that, if you have a third-party processor for credit card data and you have a good one, you're in a good position. Okay, many of our clients call us and say, we have a credit card problem and we've lost 1 million credit cards, but they're not ours. We have a processor. And then when the analysis begins, it quickly becomes apparent that they have a substantial problem with the payment card industry. In the narrowest sense, your duties and obligations are to make sure that your processor is compliant. Okay, so the simplest thing for you to do is to demand proof of compliance. All right. Everybody, any entity out there that processes credit card data has their own proofs of compliance. There's a universe of acronyms: ROCs, AOCs, SAQs in the PCI world. Self-assessment questionnaires, attestations of compliance, reports of compliance. Whatever vendor you use, ask them to share with you on a continual basis their proofs of compliance. Okay, and there's a fairly simple way to do it, but make sure they do it on a routine basis. Okay, because your vendor should be using, and I invite Mark please to add on to this. There's a whole host of things that they can and should be doing to ensure that not only that they are compliant, but they're secure, from scans to pen tests to code reviews. It's a good idea if you don't use a lot of credit card data yourself or accept a lot of credit card data, to use a good third-party vendor. It's a great idea. And then your mission is to make darn sure that they're compliant. And so in your contract with them, say, quarterly, you will send to me the following, and you will notify me within 24 hours or 12 hours of any compromise, possible compromise, suspicion of compromise of the data. We've had clients told, 45 days later that the vendor lost the data or thinks they lost the data. They're not really sure they lost the data. They may have lost the data. They're not so sure. And then you're in an awful position because some state's attorney general will take the position that you're the data owner. The data duties and obligations flow to you. And you find out 45 days later, and it puts you in an awful position. Okay, so the requirement, again, to the question that we answered earlier, simple clarity in the contract about obligations to you from the vendor are a great way to start that.
And I would just add to that, the simplest thing to ask for is called a ROC, Report on Compliance. And just ask for the ROC summary, and that will say right on the first page whether they're compliant or in some state of remediation. Easy, they should have that. But it is important because if that vendor were to have a breach, Visa and a lot of banks are able to correlate out there in internet world who's having fraud, and they all tie back to you because all these victims happen to be in your database. They can correlate fraud. They'll initially come after you, but hopefully you have defense and indemnity language in your contract with that processor. But, processor is ultimately responsible, hopefully. So.
And from an insurance standpoint, you just would want to make sure that you wouldn't have any PCI DSS exclusion, because even though it's not you who are handling the data, if in fact there was any sort of loss, you wouldn't want anything in your policy kicking out coverage for something that should be there.
Let me just add a data point. I could actually talk all day about PCI. Let me just say one thing. Most people don't know this. When the card brands suffer a loss over a certain threshold, it's called an assessment. They will issue an assessment to the entity whom they deem responsible for the compromise, okay? And they'll issue an assessment to their acquirer, acquiring bank, who will then issue an assessment to you, and they will pass on that cost if it goes above a certain threshold, okay? Our larger clients routinely get multi-million-dollar assessments from the card brands, okay? That would probably never happen to you, I would hope, for lots of reasons. Our merchant clients that do large volumes of credit card transactions have multi-million-dollar assessments subsequent to a compromise. Hopefully, you would never cross that threshold. But if you accept credit card payments, okay, and your loss exceeds certain thresholds, the card brands will issue assessments, okay? So there are certain very important things you can do. I'll just name one, okay? It is absolutely verboten to store credit card data unless it is tokenized, encrypted, and hidden under a rock, okay? So the storage of credit card data should never, ever happen. It's never necessary. Frankly, some of our clients do it because they have repeat customers. I suspect that may fit you guys. A family with 6 kids, you may want to store their credit cards so that they can routinely buy books, pay tuition, whatever it is they're going to do at your school. The storage of card data is kryptonite in your system.
I guess that's pretty clear. Any other questions? Thank you for your attention. And we have lunch for you as usual, and I know you're anxious to get back. On the other hand, you're welcome to stay. I'll ask the panel to circulate or drop in among you so that if you have any other individual questions, you're free to do that. But most importantly, thanks to all of you very much for your time and the considerable talent and knowledge that you shared with us. Have a good day, and thanks again.